welcome to the show where we share the stories of the many who intersect with our healthcare system but are rarely heard from. My name is Kevin Poe, founder and editor of Kevin MD. Today in the show, we have Jason Reminick. He is a physician entrepreneur, and he wrote the Kevin MD article, A Transformative Year for GME Recruitment, How the Process Has Changed Forever. Jason, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Kevin. It's great to be here.
We'll get into your article in a little bit, but first off, can you share your story and journey to where you are today?
Sure. I'm originally from Long Island, New York. I went to college at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia, where I studied biochemistry and theater arts, and also got a master's degree in chemistry. From there, I took a gap year working in pharma for a bit to understand how that influences the healthcare system, and then made it up to the University of Rochester, where I did my medical school degree, but also did an MBA at the Simon Business School, and then applied to residency in pediatrics and anesthesia and trained out at Stanford in their combined program there. Along the way, 2012, got stuck in New York City during Hurricane Sandy during my residency recruitment cycle, and many of my interviews were canceled. And that kind of led me down the path of where I am today in trying to build technology to improve and streamline the way that process is run, which would result in the creation of Thalamus, which I am the CEO and founder of Thalamus today, and stepped away from clinical medicine in 2018 to focus on that full time, and now serving thousands of residency and fellowship programs and close to 90% of applicants applying through the process.
I talked to a lot of physician entrepreneurs on this podcast, and some of the challenges they describe is getting the uptake of new technology from a lot of these startups. So what are some of the challenges that you face as a health technologist to have more uptake and influence?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I teach a lot of entrepreneurship. I'm a big proponent of physicians getting involved in the entrepreneurial process. And yeah, the challenge, particularly in healthcare, is always that the technology tends to lag behind where the rest of tech ends up being. And medical education tends to lag even further behind that. So it's not traditionally a market you would say, let's go here. But at the same time, there's ample opportunity in medicine. So it's really about getting the buy-in and the trust. And that was probably the hardest hurdle we had to get over, and initially started with 20 anesthesiology programs. And my co-founder is a residency program director. She had colleagues who wanted to try it at their program, and we were able to get that initial group to try the technology. And then we had the proof points and the data and the metrics that we needed to show that it would work, but we also built that trust. And I think that is the key into anyone trying to build a health tech, digital health, medical device, et cetera. You need to get the trust of the physicians and the clinicians in order to adopt that into the healthcare system, because ultimately most of this is affecting patient care in some way, and they need to know that it's going to work for their patients as well.
Now, for those physicians who are interested in getting into that entrepreneur space, what would you say is your number one tip for them?
I would say it's that balance is important in your clinical practice. I think the idea of a great clinician should also include balance. I think burnout and wellness have become sort of hot topics, and I think balance is the key in there. And that balance will allow you to have other interests where you can take your very well sought after clinical skill set and apply it to something else. And I think physicians are uniquely equipped to impact and lead innovation in healthcare. So it's finding that balance so that you can network and find those opportunities and kind of pushing yourself a bit, whether it's going to a talk on entrepreneurship, going to a co-working space, finding a networking event, joining an accelerator, just plugging yourself into the innovation ecosystem is really, I think, what it takes to push physicians to the next level.
All right, let's talk about the Kevin MD article that you wrote. It's titled, A Transformative Year for GME Recruitment, How the Process Has Changed Forever. Now, for those who didn't get a chance to read your article, can you just walk my audience through it and share the story of why you decided to write it?
Yeah, absolutely. The residency recruitment process, applying from medical school to residency, has been considered sacred in many instances. And prior to the pandemic, everything was still done in person. Increasingly competitive over the last decade, with candidates applying upwards of 70 plus programs now, when 5-10 years ago, it was closer to 15. It's very expensive. Candidates have to pay for everything out of pocket, traveling to 20 or 30 plus interviews around the country, paying for all their airfare and hotels. And it was equally expensive and time consuming for the programs to have faculty available in conference rooms and offices available. And so it was this very sacred and rightly so process where everything was done in person. All of a sudden the pandemic hits, and now what do you do with that, especially when all of the program directors and the rest of the clinical faculty are battling the pandemic on the front line. The candidates are in medical school dealing with that at their own institutions. And of course, everyone can't travel. And so what happened last year, obviously, as many other things did, was it went completely virtual. And that was a major transformation, because if you would have asked, I think, anyone prior to that, will this ever be a virtual process? The answer would have been no, which comes back to your question from before about innovation in medicine. There's that hesitancy because we know it's working, and we believed that we needed to meet everyone in person in order to best assess who was right for residency programs. No one had that luxury last year. And so everything went virtual, and GME, as it often does, quickly adapted to the technology. They changed their processes, they got faculty buy-in, the applicants learned what they needed to do also. But as a result, it was just a very different environment. If you're not traveling around the country and having to book hotel tickets and hotel reservations and plane tickets, are you still going to cancel your interviews at the same rate? Are you going to attend more interviews? What is it going to do in terms of the match rate? Is it going to affect where people match? And as the process has become more competitive, the great fear was, is there going to be a match crisis? So the idea that only the top candidates would get a large percentage of the interviews that are available around the country, because there was less of an opportunity cost to cancel. They would go to as many interviews as they possibly could, which would create a maldistribution of interviews, so that candidates who had not as great test scores or historically can be considered a weaker applicant, and I think that is up for great debate as well, but wouldn't have as many interviews. And then because of that, the top candidates would all match, but everyone else wouldn't have enough interviews, so many programs would go unfilled and many candidates would go unmatched. And so that was sort of the big fear of everyone last year. And what we saw, and why I think GME recruitment will change forever, is that match crisis did not happen. The National Residency Match Program, National Resident Matching Program, NRMP match went exactly as it seems to have always had in the past. Match rates were above 95%, as they historically been for MD students, in the high 80s, low 90 percentile for DO students, and international medical graduates, or IMGs, who have always historically matched somewhat less, were still in the 50 to 60% range. And so the match rate did drop slightly, but that was because there was a record number of people entering the match, and the number of residency positions throughout the country have not increased. So there were more people applying than ever with a fixed number of spots. So the match rate overall did drop, but overall, nearly every residency program and slot in the country filled with only 7 spots remaining at the end of the process, which is better than most years. And so what we learned also from that was that everyone saved a ton of money. It was much more equitable process. Students didn't need to travel. Programs and faculty could take the interview from home, from their office, wherever, and everyone ended up matching similar classes, is what we're hearing as well. So we've learned that there are better ways for us to do this. The question is just, now that we're going through our second season, which is essentially fully virtual interviews, what does it mean for the future? And I think the most likely scenario is some sort of screen interview that's done virtual, and then there's some sort of second look that you'll go to campus where you can meet the faculty in person and learn the hospital and the residents that are there as well. And so a lot of that still needs to be worked out in terms of policies and equity and how it will affect match rates, and trying not to benefit students who have, of course, the means to be able to fly various places as well. But I think what it's shown is that GME is very willing to innovate, and always willing to innovate, especially when they have to. And I think that was just very reassuring to see overall.
Do residency programs now have to prepare for many more applicants? And do applicants have to apply to many more residencies now that that barrier for a virtual interview is lowered?
Yeah, it's a great question. And what we saw last year was programs across the board interviewed more candidates, on average around 10% more, but applicants also interviewed at more programs, and that was also across the board. So there were more interviews, completed by everyone. There was a slightly lower cancellation rate, as would be expected, because you didn't have to fly and it's much easier to take an interview from your couch, but it resulted in everyone interviewing at more places. And so we are doing a lot of research on our end with our data team, and the amount of interviews people were going on prior to the virtual recruitment season was way more than they needed to. With the pandemic and the virtual recruitment season, everyone is still interviewing at many more places than they need to. We completed a study in anesthesia looking at the data going back over a 4-year cycle, and roughly the average anesthesia program in the country could cut out 18% of their interviews of very low likely to match interviews, and their final match list wouldn't change. We're repeating that study now in primary care for pediatrics, internal medicine, family medicine, and seeing that number actually jumps up. So while it has been competitive and students are applying to more places, which is creating somewhat of a transparency problem, there are still many interviews that are going on that have a very low likelihood of success. There are predictors in the data as to who ends up matching where, and all in all, the match rate has held pretty consistent over time. So I think the challenge for GME right now is finding those processes where we can show the applicants real data that says you don't need to apply to this many programs, or maybe if you're coming from an area or a part of the world, or essentially outside the United States where your match rate is historically lower, maybe you do need to apply more, but here's where you can target yourself so you don't have to fill out as many applications, and that will result in just a more targeted recruitment. And I think programs are looking into that as well, for the first time having to essentially brand their program in the digital sense. And I think a lot have adopted that on social media and various accounts and getting their residents involved. And so it's been a very interesting transformation of the process.
You mentioned this upcoming interview season. The first pass is still all virtual. Where do you see that trend going in the next 3 to 5 years?
Yeah, I think it's going to take some time. I think what we saw this year prior to Delta coming back around was that there was a big push amongst programs to try and continue to do it in person. And there was a lot of discussion just within medical education. Well, how do we do this? And maybe my program wants to do this fully virtually. And I think we're going to see different shifts and different models. I think some will go back to in-person. I think some will stay virtual. And I think you'll see various forms of hybrid. I think it will take probably, say, 3 to 5 years to settle on what that's going to mean. In the meantime, there's been a lot of just innovative spirit amongst GME, and the specialty organizations overall are getting quite involved, and they're trying different ideas. Otolaryngology is trying a preference signaling solution. Internal medicine, surgery, and dermatology are trying a supplemental application, and there are various other universal interview offer days done by OBGYN and plastic surgery. And so everyone's trying something new. And I think that's exciting to see, because I think in recent years, this is the first time we're ever seeing this sort of big push from GME universally.
We're talking to Jason Reminick. He's a physician entrepreneur, and he wrote the Kevin MD article, A Transformative Year for GME Recruitment, How the Process Has Changed Forever. Jason, knowing what you know about the trends and the data, what kind of advice can you give to prospective residency applicants going forward?
I think it's really important to understand what your goals are as a physician and finding the program that's right for you. A lot of applicants come to us and say, I want to get into the best program with the highest ranked program, et cetera. And that's not necessarily the best way to look at it, because you need to find the practice environment and the program that's going to help you obtain your professional goals. And that could be serving an underserved population in a rural area, in an urban center, in a big city, in a small city, with a particular patient population or otherwise. And that's what you need to focus on and target. So understanding where you are as an applicant, trying not to buy into the anxiety of the process, and just taking a step back and saying, where am I going to be successful as a physician? Where am I likely going to get into that program based on historical data, based on who I am as a person, how I'm putting my application together, talking with mentors, talking with upperclassmen, people who've graduated from your medical school or otherwise, and really just figuring out what are going to be the best programs for me. And I think It's so easy to say that. It's obviously much harder to adopt that practice, especially when you're going through a very just anxiety-provoking process of this recruitment process when you've worked your whole life to get somewhere. But I think at the end of the day, that's ultimately what's going to succeed. And I think you see that transformation every year after match day for the people who have matched, like, I probably could have approached this a little bit differently. And I think the more we can get that perspective at the beginning of the process, the better off applicants and programs will be overall.
And my final question, what's your take-home message?
I think it's really important to look at the residency recruitment process as something that every practicing physician in the US, whether they trained in the US or trained in another country or practice medicine in another country, and it ultimately affects the entire physician workforce, but it's rarely looked at and discussed. And so there are many ways that all of us as physicians can impact, and not only our profession, but also patient care. And so I think it's very important for us to recognize our pipeline as to where our physicians are coming from and who they are, but also that this ultimately affects how we treat patients and ultimately how healthcare can change for the better for the future, because this is where sort of it's our minor league system coming up into the major leagues. And if we want to continue to win the World Series or whatever other metaphor you'd like to use, this is the future of medicine coming through this pipeline. And so I think the more we can bring it to light and the more we can innovate and make it better for ourselves and our practice, it will ultimately affect our patients.
Jason, thank you so much for sharing your time and insight. And thanks again for being on the show.
Thanks so much.